I recently did something that 25 years of training, a decade in SWAT, and a half-decade as chief of police never prepared me for. I stood on my own front porch, a place I had chosen for its quiet promise of peace, and I let two men dressed in cheap, fraudulent police costumes put me in handcuffs. I let them cinch the cold, biting metal around my wrists, while their employer, the self-appointed queen of my new neighborhood, grinned from ear to ear like she'd just personally overseen the fall of a rival empire. And their reason? The flimsy justification for this entire theatrical display of force? They claimed I was in violation of community bylaws. The funny thing is, the only thing being tested that day was the near infinite depths of my patience, not the laughable limits of their authority. They thought they were running a game, a simple play of intimidation against a new, unsuspecting resident. They had no idea they were the lead actors in a carefully orchestrated sting operation, that every word they spoke, every move they made, was being recorded, analyzed, and logged as evidence. They had no idea their star witness was also their primary target. They thought they were making an arrest. In reality, they were making a confession. Let me take you back to the beginning. I am standing in the cavernous, echoing space of my new living room. The air is thick with the sharp, clean smell of fresh paint, a scent that for most people signifies a new beginning, but for me, smells like a clean slate, a place to finally wash away the grime of a long and violent career. Boxes are everywhere, stacked in precarious towers, cardboard mountains I must climb to reclaim my own life. One is labeled Kitchen, with a smiley face drawn in marker. Another, in my late wife's elegant pointed script, says Old Files Burn. I have to allow myself a small, sad smile at that one. Sarah had a wickedly sharp sense of humor about the baggage that came with my job. She called my study the Ghost Room. Most of those files are commendations that gather dust and case notes from 25 years on the force, 15 leading a SWAT team through the darkest doors in this city, 5 as a lead homicide detective chasing monsters, and the last 5 as the chief of police, a job that was more about politics and paperwork than justice. This house is my reward for a lifetime of chaos. It is my quiet place. It is my decompression chamber. The street is a portrait of suburban tranquility, lined with ancient, paternal oak trees that form a protective canopy overhead. The houses are neat, well-maintained, the lawns a deep, uniform green that speaks of weekend chores and quiet pride. It's the kind of neighborhood where the loudest sound you hear in the morning is the cheerful chirping of birds, not the distant, mournful wail of sirens. I bought it specifically for that silence. It's a sound I'm trying to get used to. My grandpa, a man who saw enough noise and chaos to last 10 lifetimes in the European theater during World War II, used to have a saying. "A man's home is his castle," he'd tell me, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "But remember, son, the best castles have quiet neighbors." I'm hoping for quiet neighbors. I'm hoping to finally pull up the drawbridge and live a life where every stranger isn't a potential threat. I slice open a box labeled Books with my pocket knife. On top of a stack of worn history paperbacks is a framed black and white photograph of him. He's a young man in the photo, ramrod straight in his old army uniform, his jaw set, his eyes looking off into a distance only he could see. He looks stern. But if you look closely, you can see that same rebellious twinkle I remember from my childhood. He was the man who taught me how to shoot, how to fish, and how to spot a liar a mile away by the way they held their hands. He believed in order, real, genuine order, the kind that lets good people live their lives in peace and dignity. Not the fussy, arbitrary, bureaucratic kind of order that exists only to serve the ego of the person enforcing it, but the sturdy, common-sense kind. He'd like this place. He'd tell me to check the fence line first thing, to establish my perimeter. But this neighborhood, in a sign of what I hoped was communal trust, doesn't have fences. It feels open. It feels like a nice change. For 3 weeks, it is perfect. It's more than perfect. It's a revelation. I unpack the mountains of cardboard. I set up my workshop in the garage, where the familiar, comforting scent of sawdust and gun oil was a welcome respite from the sterile world of paperwork and city politics I had just left behind. I met a few people. A neighbor named Duke from across the street, a big, burly man with a laugh that seems to shake the leaves on the trees, gives me a hearty wave every morning. He seems to be in a permanent, one-man war against fallen leaves with a leaf blower that sounds like a jet engine. A young family next door, the Hendersons, brings over a plate of still warm chocolate chip cookies. It feels like a real community, the kind of place people talk about but rarely find. The job, the ghosts, the weight of the badge, it all feels a million miles away. For the first time in my adult life, I start to breathe again, really breathe, from the bottom of my lungs. For the first time in years, I start to sleep through the night without a weapon within arm's reach. Then the first piece of paper appears. It isn't in the mailbox, a violation of federal law, I immediately note. It's tucked under the wiper blade of my truck. My personal pickup, a vintage Ford F-150 I'd spent years restoring, not my city-issued black-on-black command vehicle. The paper is a startlingly bright red, the color of a stop sign, a warning color. The words are printed in an angry, bold, sans serif font, a typeface that practically screams from the page, "Violation Notice." I unfold it. My lawn, a perfectly respectable carpet of green, is apparently 1/4 of an inch too high. It violates, the notice informs me, Section 4, Paragraph B of the Oak Street Community Covenants. A fine of $50 is assessed. The notice is signed, in a sharp, aggressive script, by a Karen Vanfleet, President, Oak Street Homeowners Association. I look at my lawn. It looks fine. I look at my neighbor Duke's lawn. It looks identical. I feel a familiar tightening in my gut, a cold, heavy sensation I know all too well. It's the feeling I get when I see a bully picking on someone smaller on a playground, or a con artist preying on the elderly. It's not anger, not yet. It's a cold, heavy sense of duty, a professional recognition of a pattern. I've seen this 1,000 times in my career, on a much larger scale. Someone gets a little taste of imaginary power, a title on a piece of paper, a seat on a committee, and it goes straight to their head like cheap whiskey. They invent rules to feel important. They create a twisted, self-serving version of order that benefits no one but their own fragile ego. I fold the notice and slide it into my pocket. I decide to ignore it. A mistake, I know. A professional cop never ignores the first sign of trouble. But it's my day off. I want to pretend, just for a little while longer, that I'm just a guy in a new house with a lawn that's 1/4 of an inch too long, not a seasoned law enforcement officer who can already smell the rot of a criminal enterprise. The next day, there are 2 red notices tucked under my wiper blade. One is a second warning for the lawn, the fine now doubled to $100 for failure to comply. The new one is for my trash can. It was, according to the notice, visible from the street for a period exceeding 3 hours past the designated pickup time. This fine is $75. The total is now $175. This Karen Vanfleet is efficient, I'll give her that. But her efficiency is starting to feel less like a nuisance and more like a probe, a systematic test of my defenses. She's rattling the fence, wanting to see if there's a dog in this yard, and if it will bite. The language on the notices is escalating. Phrases like immediate compliance required and further legal action will be taken are sprinkled throughout. It's boilerplate intimidation, the kind of pseudo-legal jargon carefully crafted to scare people who don't know any better. People who see an official-looking piece of paper and assume it holds the actual power of the law. My grandpa's face comes to my mind again. He would have had a name for her. A pocket tyrant. A small person making a lot of noise to seem big. He would have also told me, his voice a low growl, that you don't let a weed take over your garden. You pull it up by the roots, fast and clean, before it can choke out everything good. I look out my window, and I see her. A woman is walking a small, yapping dog that looks as perpetually annoyed as she does. She stops in front of my house, her head tilted, her gaze a critical sweep of my property. She makes a note on a clipboard. She has sharp, angular features and a severe, asymmetrical haircut that you could use to level a picture frame. I have a gut feeling, the kind that has kept me alive for 25 years, that I'm looking at Karen Vanfleet. As if sensing my gaze, she looks directly toward my window, and our eyes meet through the glass. She doesn't smile. She doesn't look away. She gives me a look of pure, unadulterated smugness, the look of a queen surveying her domain and finding it wanting, the look of a predator that has just identified its next meal. My quiet street doesn't feel so quiet anymore. It feels like occupied territory. The test is over. The probe is complete. Now I have to decide how to respond. And for a man like me, a man who has dedicated his life to the real, tangible rule of law, there's only one way to deal with a bully who wraps herself in the cloak of fake authority. You don't just prove her wrong. You don't just defy her. You methodically, systematically, and completely dismantle her entire world with the real thing. She's about to find out what happens when her imaginary kingdom, built on a foundation of paper and fear, collides with my actual jurisdiction. Her little game is over. My game is just beginning. The next morning, I was up at 0400. It's a habit forged in the fires of 1,000 pre-dawn raids and emergency call-outs, a discipline so deeply etched into my DNA that no amount of quiet retirement can erase it. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, the house still and silent around me. On my tablet, the morning intelligence brief from the Joint Counterterrorism Task Force was open. It was Sunday, September 7th. The lead story was about a developing situation in Karachi, a complex web of money laundering and extremist networks that threatened to destabilize the region. I read the cold, classified prose, my mind automatically dissecting the intelligence, mapping the networks, identifying the key players. It was a world of immense, deadly consequence, a world I had once inhabited. I took a sip of coffee and looked out the window at the quiet, sleeping houses of Oak Street. It was a jarring contrast. The world worries about terror cells in Karachi, and here I am, in my own backyard, about to dismantle a different kind of insurgency, a tyranny of one, built on red paper and petty cruelty. The scale was different, but the principles of the fight were exactly the same. I didn't drive to my office at the police department, with its panoramic view of the city skyline and its endless stacks of paperwork. My first move in this new, unofficial operation was to go low-tech. I drove my personal truck downtown to the county clerk's office. It's an old, imposing building, all marble and dust, a place that smells of old paper, floor wax, and the slow, grinding gears of bureaucracy. I've always liked it. It's a place of facts, and facts are stubborn things. They don't bend to opinion or bluster. They are the unshakable foundation upon which the entire structure of the law is built. And I was here to get my foundation stone. I walked up to the public records counter. A woman with glasses perched on a silver chain looked up at me over a mountain of files. She had the weary, seen-it-all expression of a career civil servant who deals with 100 different human dramas a day, from bitter divorce filings to sovereign citizens trying to declare their houses independent nations. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, the question a statement of duty, not an offer of assistance. "Yes, ma'am," I said, giving her a respectful nod. I learned a long time ago that the gatekeepers of information, the clerks and the administrators, are the most important people in any building. "I'd like to see the incorporation papers and all filed covenants for a homeowners association." I slid a piece of paper across the counter with the name neatly printed on it. The Oak Street Homeowners Association. She sighed, a sound of profound institutional fatigue, and turned to her ancient beige computer terminal. Her fingers moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, tapping on the yellowed keys. She squinted at the green text on the monochrome screen. She typed the name again, then a third time, checking her spelling. She leaned back in her chair and let out another long, weary sigh. It was a sound that said, "Here we go again." "There's no record of any homeowners association by that name," she said, her voice devoid of surprise. "Not in this county." I nodded slowly, my face a neutral mask, but inside, the first piece of the puzzle clicked firmly into place. I expected this. My instincts, honed by decades of investigations, had told me this was a sham. But expecting something and having official, certified proof of it are two very different things in my world. Expectation is a hunch. Proof is a weapon. "Could you please check for any variations?" I asked, my tone polite and patient. "Oak Street Community Association, Oak Street Neighbors, anything with Oak Street in the title." She typed again, her sighs now punctuated by a low muttering. "Nothing. Not a thing." I ran a wildcard search on the entire subdivision plat. There has never been a registered, mandatory HOA for that entire area. It was zoned single-family residential back in the 70s. No restrictive covenants were ever filed with the original plat deeds. She finally turned her full attention to me, her eyes sharp and curious behind her glasses. "Are you sure you have the name right, sir?" "I'm very sure," I said, and I slid one of the bright red violation notices across the counter. She picked it up gingerly, as if it were contaminated. She held it up to the light, then read the angry, bold text. A small, humorless smile, the first sign of life I'd seen from her, touched the corners of her lips. "Ah," she said, a world of understanding and weary recognition in that single sound. "One of these." "It happens often?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "More than you'd think," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Suddenly my ally in the fight against bureaucratic chaos. "Someone gets a bug up their bonnet, decides they're the queen of the block. They go online, print up some official-looking letterhead, maybe even invent a fancy title for themselves. Most people just pay. They're good people. They're afraid of trouble. They don't want to make waves." She tapped the red notice with a long, painted fingernail. That's the fuel a pocket tyrant runs on, the fear of making waves. They count on good people being quiet. "I need a certified letter," I said, my voice firm. "A legal document stating that an official search of the county records was conducted, and that no homeowners association with that name, or any associated restrictive covenants, exists or has ever existed for that subdivision." Her smile widened a little. She was enjoying this now. She was a foot soldier in the army of order, and she had just been given a chance to strike a blow against the forces of chaos. An official letter, on county letterhead, with a notarized signature and a raised seal, will cost you $25. "I'll take 2 copies," I said. "One for my records and one for theirs." While she went into a back room to prepare the documents, my mind was already moving 5 steps ahead. I thought about Karen Vanfleet. I thought about the sheer, breathtaking audacity of it, to just invent an organization out of thin air, to wrap it in the language of law and order, and to use that phantom as a weapon to extort money from your own neighbors. It was fraud on its face. But it was more than that. It was conspiracy. And it was a direct, insidious assault on the very concept of the rule of law. It creates a shadow government on a single street, a petty dictatorship run by the whims of one person. When does order stop serving people? It stops the moment it's disconnected from truth and consent. My grandpa, the man in the photo on my mantle, had served in a war against people who had decided, on a national scale, that they could write their own rules for everyone else. He had seen firsthand what happens when lies are allowed to fester and grow into something that looks like power. He'd say this little HOA is a symptom of a bigger sickness, a lack of respect for the lines, for the fundamental principles that separate a free society from a collection of prisoners. The clerk returned with 2 crisp, official-looking documents. She had also, on her own initiative, checked the state business registry. No HOA, no nonprofit, no corporation under any variation of the name existed there either. She had included that in the letter. The embossed golden seal on the bottom of the page was raised. The paper felt heavy in my hand. It was a weapon. A simple, quiet, powerful weapon made of paper and truth. I could go home right now. I could walk across the street to Karen's house, hand her this piece of paper, and watch the smug satisfaction drain from her face. I could show it to my neighbors. The game would be over in an instant. But that's not enough. A good cop knows the difference between stopping a crime and delivering justice. Just stopping her wouldn't be justice. She wouldn't really stop. She'd just move, or change the name of her fake HOA, or find a new crop of victims in another town. You don't just scare a wolf away from the flock of sheep. You track it, you trap it, and you cage it. This letter from the clerk proves she has no authority, but it doesn't prove her crimes. For that, I need more. I need to let her keep playing her game. I need to give her more rope. I need her to escalate. I need to catch her, and anyone working with her, in an act so undeniable, so brazen, that a judge will have no choice but to make a public example of her. This isn't about a $50 fine anymore. It's not even about my street. It's about all the people who have been bullied into paying, the ones who may have been forced to move away because of the relentless harassment. I can see their files in my mind, even though I haven't found them yet. I know they exist. Bullies, whether they run a street corner or a city block, always leave a trail of broken lives. On the drive home, I made a call. Not to 911, not to the DA's office. I called my best lieutenant, Danny Reyes. She's my rock at the department, the person I trust implicitly. She's smart, she's calm under pressure, and she knows the intricacies of the law better than most lawyers. "Danny, it's Mark," I said when she answered. "Everything okay, Chief? You're supposed to be enjoying your well-earned vacation." "Mostly," I said. "Listen, I need a quiet, off-the-books background check. Level 1 for now. A woman named Karen Vanfleet. Lives on my street." There was a pause, then a chuckle. "What did she do?" "Criticize your gardening skills?" Danny's humor is as dry as a West Texas summer. "Something like that," I said. "Just give me the basics. Priors, financials, known associates. Keep it on your desktop only. I don't want a digital trail leading back to the department. Not yet." "You got it," she said. "Is this going to be one of your projects?" I could hear the smile in her voice. My projects were legendary at the precinct. Cases that started small, a loose thread that nobody else saw, the ones that, when pulled, unraveled into something big and ugly. "Let's just say," I told her, "I think I found a weed in my new garden. And I'm going to need a bigger shovel." I hung up. The certified letter from the county sat on the passenger seat next to me. It was the truth. But the truth isn't always enough. Sometimes, to win the war, you have to let the lie get so big, so audacious, that when it finally collapses, it takes everyone and everything involved down with it. Karen Vanfleet wants to play a game of rules and consequences. She has no idea I've been playing that game my whole life. And in my game, I make the rules. She's about to escalate, and I am going to be ready for her. I sat at my kitchen table, the certified letter from the county, my silver bullet, lying next to my coffee mug. It was Sunday, September 7th, 2025. According to the clock on my tablet, it was 2:12 p.m. in Karachi, Pakistan. I knew this because the lead story on my morning intelligence brief was a developing situation there, a complex web of money laundering and extremist networks that was threatening to destabilize the entire region. I had spent the first hour of my day mapping that network in my head, identifying the key players, the financial choke points, the lines of communication. It was a world of immense, deadly consequence, a world I had once inhabited, a world where a single mistake could cost hundreds of lives. Then I looked out my window at the quiet, sun-drenched houses of Oak Street. The jarring contrast was almost comical. The world was worried about terror cells in Karachi, and here I was, in my own backyard, preparing to dismantle a different kind of insurgency, a tyranny of one, built on red paper and petty cruelty. The scale was laughably different, but the principles of the fight were exactly the same. An illegitimate power structure was using fear and misinformation to extort resources from a compliant population. Whether in a dusty province overseas or a manicured American suburb, the tactics of the bully are universal. And so are the methods used to break them. To defeat an enemy, you must first understand him. You must map his kingdom, identify his lieutenants, understand the source of his power, and find the cracks in his armor. Karen Vanfleet, who I now learned from Danny's preliminary background check, was actually named Evelyn Reed. Karen was apparently a nickname she'd earned in a previous neighborhood before moving here, had built her kingdom with the precision of a master propagandist. My deep dive into the public-facing HOA documents, which were little more than a glorified website and a series of poorly photocopied newsletters, revealed a masterclass in petty tyranny, built on a foundation of expertly weaponized bureaucracy. She had taken a sleepy, benign, and long-defunct neighborhood social committee, and through a series of expertly manipulated board meetings with historically low turnout, had resurrected it as her own personal enforcement agency. She controlled the three key committees that gave her HOA its teeth: the Architectural Review Committee, the Covenants Committee, and the Fining Committee. And she had stacked each one with her own hand-picked sycophants. The ARC, which was supposed to be a panel of residents ensuring aesthetic harmony, was in reality a three-person goon squad. Its chairman was Evelyn's personal injury lawyer, a man whose own home had a garish, non-compliant fountain in the front yard. The other two members were the wives of her weekend golfing partners. They didn't review submissions based on merit. They reviewed them based on loyalty. If you were in Evelyn's good graces, you could paint your house purple and install a 10-foot-tall metal sculpture of a chicken on your lawn. If you weren't, you'd get a violation notice for having a welcome mat that was half an inch too wide. They were the gatekeepers, and the toll was absolute fealty to the Queen. The Covenants Committee was her intelligence-gathering wing, a suburban Stasi composed of a network of busybodies and bored retirees who were rewarded with gift cards to local restaurants and, more importantly, a sense of vicarious power for reporting on their neighbors. They were encouraged to submit anonymous complaints through the HOA website, which Evelyn would then use to initiate the harassment process. It was a perfect system of control, turning neighbor against neighbor, fostering an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that prevented any organized opposition from forming. But the true source of her power, the sharp, poisoned end of the spear, was the fining committee. Chaired by Evelyn herself, this was the star chamber where guilt was predetermined and appeals were a theatrical formality. She had rewritten the bylaws to grant this committee unilateral authority to levy fines, place liens, and even initiate foreclosure proceedings, all without any meaningful oversight or due process. She had built a system that allowed her to legally steal people's homes, and she had done it all under the noble-sounding guise of maintaining property values. To understand the true nature of her evil, I had to look at her victims. I began a quiet, door-to-door canvass, not as a police chief, but as a concerned new neighbor. I started with Duke. His story of the non-compliant garden gnome was funny, but it was the tip of the iceberg. He pointed me to the house at the end of the block, the one that had been for sale for the past 6 months. "Talk to the Holloways," he said, his voice dropping, "if you can find them." Evelyn ran them out of town. It took me a day of searching public records and making discreet inquiries, but I found them. The Holloways, an elderly couple, both in their late 70s. Mr. Holloway was a Vietnam veteran, a quiet man of immense pride. His wife, Mary, loved 2 things in this world: her husband and her garden. Her crime, in the eyes of Evelyn Reed, was a small, elegant birdbath she had placed among her prize-winning roses. The story, which I pieced together from a tearful phone call with their daughter, was a slow-motion execution. It started with a notice about the birdbath being an unapproved permanent structure. The fine was $100. Mr. Holloway, a man who had fought for his country and respected the rule of law, wrote a polite letter of appeal, pointing out that 3 other houses on the street had identical bird baths. The fining committee, which was to say Evelyn, denied his appeal without comment. A week later, a second notice arrived. The fine had been compounded with a $50 per day late fee. The notices kept coming. Failure to remediate. Legal review fee. Aesthetic disharmony penalty. They were entirely fabricated charges, designed for no other purpose than to bleed them dry. The Holloways, living on a fixed income of Social Security and a small military pension, couldn't keep up. The stress was immense. Mr. Holloway, who had a history of heart trouble, began to decline. His blood pressure skyrocketed. He stopped sleeping. They tried to fight. They went to a board meeting to plead their case. Their daughter showed me a cell phone video of the meeting. It was sickening. Evelyn sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, flanked by her cronies, and she publicly berated the decorated veteran, calling him a delinquent and a detriment to the community. She refused to let him speak, gaveling him down every time he tried to protest. Isolated and terrified, they fell behind on the fines. When the total reached an impossible $20,000, Evelyn made her final brutal move. She had the HOA's lawyer, the same man who chaired the ARC, place a lien on their home. They were served with foreclosure papers. 3 days later, Mr. Holloway suffered a massive heart attack. He survived, but the doctors told him the stress was a major contributing factor. Faced with losing their home and the prospect of a long, ugly legal battle they couldn't afford, they did the only thing they could. They sold their home of 40 years to a holding company for a fraction of its market value, just to escape. That was the end of their story. But it wasn't the end of mine. I dug into that holding company. It was the same pattern I'd seen in my organized crime investigations. A ghost LLC, with a P.O. box for an address. But every ghost leaves a trail. The registered agent was a law firm. The partner who signed the incorporation documents was Evelyn Reed's brother. She hadn't just bullied an elderly couple. She had orchestrated a predatory, fraudulent scheme to steal their home and its equity, likely selling it to an associate for a profit. This wasn't just an abuse of power. This was a criminal conspiracy that had nearly killed a man. The network was a tangled web of nepotism and kickbacks. The HOA's exclusive and mandatory landscaping contractor, Prestige Landscaping, was owned by that same brother. The city councilman who represented our district, Bob Laren, was a former business partner of Evelyn's from her failed real estate career. A quick review of Lauren's voting record showed that he had personally blocked 2 separate municipal investigations into the Creekwood HOA, citing a lack of credible evidence. She had built a wall around her kingdom, not just with bylaws, but with a corrupt, political ally who ensured her impunity. With this knowledge, the harassment campaign against me snapped into sharp focus. The initial notices were probes, tests of compliance. When I met them with silence, she assumed I was another soft target. The escalation was her standard operating procedure. She was following the same playbook she had used to break the Holloways. She had built a fortress of paper and fear, defended by family connections and political favors. She thought she was untouchable. She believed she was the law. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend, was that her calculated provocations hadn't just poked a bear. They had awakened a ghost. She had declared war on the one man in her entire corrupt ecosystem who knew how to dismantle kingdoms. The time for observation was over. The time for dismantlement had begun. The night after my tour of the neighborhood was a descent into a cold, familiar darkness. This was not the darkness of despair or fear. It was the darkness of the hunt. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, a tactical disadvantage I would not permit. While the quiet houses of Oak Street slept under a blanket of suburban peace, I sat in the sterile blue glow of my monitors, the war having already begun. My rage, a white-hot supernova that threatened to consume me in the moments I learned of the Holloway's fate, had been transmuted. I had taken that raw, explosive energy and compressed it, channeling it into the cold, clean lines of a mission plan. It became fuel. It became focus. My home office, once a sanctuary for reading history, was no longer a room. It was the nerve center of a covert intelligence operation. My objective was simple: not just to defeat Evelyn Reed, but to utterly dismantle her reality, to erase her empire so completely that the world would forget she ever had one. I glanced at the global clock on my screen. It was 2:15 p.m. in Karachi, Sindh, Pakistan. The intelligence brief I had read just hours before detailed a deteriorating security situation there, a complex web of terror financing and political instability. I had spent half my career tracking men who operated in those shadows, men who moved millions of dollars through phantom corporations to fund violence on a global scale. Now, I was applying that same skill set, that same relentless focus, to a woman who used a fake HOA to steal a war hero's home. The absurdity was staggering, but the underlying principle was identical. An illegitimate power was exploiting a system for personal gain and causing immense human suffering. The scale was different, but the cancer was the same. And the treatment, I knew, was always surgical. You don't just remove the tumor. You cut out every cancerous cell around it. The first phase of any operation is intelligence gathering. You don't fire a shot until you know the enemy's strength, his weaknesses, his patterns, and his fears. You build a target package so detailed, so intimate, that you know him better than he knows himself. I began with open-source intelligence, the art of finding diamonds in the digital garbage of the modern world. I wasn't just looking for information. I was hunting for leverage. My first targets were the instruments, not the architect. the two thugs in the fake uniforms. Men like them are simple creatures, driven by ego and insecurity. Their digital footprints are sloppy. The bigger one, the one who had cuffed me, was easy. A quick cross-reference of local gym social media pages and a facial recognition search turned up a name in under 5 minutes. Rick Steiner. His profiles were a pathetic monument to a life of mediocrity and borrowed toughness. Pictures of him flexing in a dirty mirror, posts filled with misspelled political rants, and a long, bitter history of complaining about ex-girlfriends. But amidst the noise, I found the signal. I accessed a public court records database and ran his name. 2 prior assault charges, both from bar fights, both pleaded down to misdemeanors by a cheap public defender. The original police reports, however, were public record. I downloaded them. They painted a clear picture of a man with no impulse control, a bully who preyed on those he perceived as weaker. More importantly, they listed his previous addresses and employers. One of those employers was a warehouse logistics company where he had been fired for theft. Another loose thread. The smaller one, the driver, was even easier. His name was Leo. He was a classic wannabe trying to ride the coattails of a bigger predator. His social media was a fire hose of youthful stupidity. He had posted a picture of himself and Rick just last week, leaning against Evelyn's black SUV, both of them wearing their cheap Oak Street community enforcement polos. Leo's caption read, "New gig, keeping the neighborhood safe. #, security #, enforcement #, making moves." It was a gift. It was photographic evidence of their conspiracy, time-stamped and geotagged. It was the kind of amateur, ego-driven mistake that gets real operations blown, and it confirmed I was dealing with clowns, not professionals. This wasn't a sophisticated security detail. It was a goon squad for hire. Evelyn Reed was a different challenge. Her digital life was a fortress, meticulously curated by a team of public relations professionals she likely couldn't afford. Her LinkedIn profile was a monument to her civic leadership and business acumen. Her name appeared in dozens of puff pieces in local business journals and on the websites of the charities to which she made very public, very calculated, tax-deductible donations. She was a pillar of the community, a woman of wealth and taste. It was a beautiful and very expensive lie. To find the truth, I had to go back in time. I used the Wayback Machine, a digital archive of the internet, to find older, less sanitized versions of her defunct real estate agency's website. I dug through archived newspaper articles from a decade ago, back when her star was still rising. And there, buried on page C14 of a 2014 article from the City Business Chronicle about her ambitious Maple Lane Estates development project, I found the crack in her armor. The article was celebratory, but it mentioned, in passing, the project's unconventional financing structure, which relied on a consortium of private, out-of-state lenders. Private lenders are not, by themselves, a red flag. But for a project of that scale, it was highly unusual. It hinted at a woman who couldn't secure traditional financing from a reputable bank. It hinted at a woman who was a bigger risk than she appeared. It was the scent of desperation, preserved in the digital amber of a forgotten news article. That was the thread I would pull until her entire world unraveled. With the digital profiles built, I moved to the second phase: signals intelligence and surveillance. I needed to understand their patterns, their rhythms, their habits. I needed to map their world in real time. My own home security system, a series of high-definition cameras I had installed when we moved in, provided the baseline. I spent hours reviewing the footage from the past month, cross-referencing the timestamps with the violation notices we had received. A clear pattern emerged. Their patrols weren't random. They were targeted. They would drive past my house an average of 4 times a day, slowing down each time. They weren't just patrolling. They were observing. They were trying to intimidate. But I needed more than just a view from my own fortress. I needed to see the entire battle space. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, I deployed my own surveillance assets. In a grove of trees on the edge of the public park land that bordered our neighborhood, a spot that provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the single entrance to Creekwood Estates, I installed a small, weatherproof trail camera with a cellular data link. It was motion-activated and had a powerful telephoto lens that could capture license plates from a quarter-mile away. Now I would see every vehicle that came and went, and I would have a time-stamped record of it. My second asset was more audacious. I had kept a few tools from my old life, pieces of gear that were technically civilian legal, but were miles beyond what any normal person would own. One of them was a high-gain parabolic microphone. At 0300, I took a walk along the public creek path that ran behind the neighborhood. I found a spot directly behind the small brick-and-mortar community clubhouse, where Evelyn held her star chamber meetings. I concealed the microphone inside a hollowed-out, fallen log, its sensitive dish aimed directly at the clubhouse's thin, single-pane rear window. It was a long shot, but if Evelyn was foolish enough to discuss her criminal activities within those walls, I would now have a seat at the table. For 2 days, I did nothing but watch and listen. I compiled a detailed pattern of life analysis on Rick and Leo. Their discipline was pathetic. Their patrols started promptly at 900 hours, but by 9:30, they were parked at a local donut shop. They spent nearly 2 hours at the same greasy sandwich joint for lunch every day. Rick took a smoke break every 45 minutes, always in the same spot behind the clubhouse, where he would complain loudly on his phone about his alimony payments. They were lazy, predictable, and utterly unprofessional. They were an occupying force that had grown fat and complacent on the fear of unarmed civilians. The final phase, the one that would provide the kill shot, was financial intelligence. The Maple Lane Estates project was the key. I spent an entire night in the deep web, using encrypted servers and a series of anonymizing relays to access international financial databases, the kind of places where money goes to hide. I was a ghost in the machine, a digital phantom hunting for the sins of a real estate developer, and I found them. The consortium of private lenders was a network of offshore holding companies based in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, all classic havens for money laundering. Following the trail of wire transfers was like navigating a labyrinth, but it was a skill I had honed, hunting the financiers of global terrorism. I traced the money from the lenders to a series of shell corporations Evelyn had set up, and then to the Maple Lane project's primary accounts. And that's where I found the fraud. She had used inflated property appraisals and forged construction invoices to secure far more funding than the project actually cost. She had created millions of dollars in phantom expenses. The excess cash, the dirty money, hadn't just vanished. She had laundered it, and the primary instrument for that laundering was a holding company called Reed Equity Partners. My blood ran cold when I saw the name again. It was the same company that had bought the Holloway's home. She hadn't just bullied them. She had used their stolen equity as a cog in her money laundering machine. She had folded her local crimes into her larger federal ones. This was the lever. This was the weapon. This wasn't just a violation of local ordinances. This was a potential violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, the law that was created to dismantle the mafia. She was using a legitimate-seeming enterprise, her fake HOAS, to conduct a pattern of criminal activity, including mail fraud, for the threatening notices, wire fraud, for the financial schemes, and extortion, for what she did to the Holloways and was trying to do to me. I sat back in my chair, the first rays of dawn painting the eastern sky. The target package was complete. I had her psychology, her patterns, and her crimes, all neatly compiled in a multi-layered, encrypted file. I had her. She just didn't know it yet. She thought this was a neighborhood dispute, a game of fines and regulations that she could win, because she wrote the rules. She couldn't possibly comprehend that she was now the target of a full-spectrum intelligence operation being run by a man who had been trained by the United States government to dismantle regimes. She thought she was a queen in her castle. I had just finished mapping every secret passage, every structural weakness, and every escape tunnel. My finger hovered over the mouse. I opened a secure, encrypted communication channel and selected a single contact from a list of ghosts. A man I had not spoken to in 3 years. A man who now worked as a senior prosecutor in the Department of Justice's Public Integrity section. I attached the file. The subject line was simple. Unconventional target package. High confidence. I wrote a short, 2-sentence message. It's Mark. I'm retired and I'm safe. I think you'll find this interesting. I hit send. The missile was launched. The war had moved from the shadows into the light. And Evelyn Reed, in her arrogant, blissful ignorance, had no idea that her world was about to end. She was about to learn the difference between a neighborhood bully and a man who had hunted monsters for a living. For 3 days, the world held its breath. The silence that followed my digital missile launch to the Department of Justice was not the silence of peace, but the charged, heavy quiet of a cold war. It was the unnatural stillness before a storm, a palpable tension in the air that only a man trained in threat recognition could feel. At 2:23 p.m. on Sunday, September 7th, 2025, in Karachi, Sindh, Pakistan, it was a hot, dusty afternoon, and federal agents were likely moving on the intelligence that men like me provided, navigating a world of real, lethal consequences. Here on Oak Street, in the deceptive tranquility of my own neighborhood, I was also watching a hostile network. But my enemy was a different kind of insurgent. Evelyn Reed was wounded, exposed, her carefully constructed reputation smoldering from the internal fires of community outrage and the unseen external pressure of a nascent federal inquiry she couldn't yet detect. A predictable man, a rational criminal, would have retreated, lawyered up, and tried to manage the fallout. But Evelyn was not just a criminal. She was a narcissist. And a cornered narcissist does not retreat. They escalate. They attempt to burn the world that has rejected them. I knew she was coming. It was the only move left on the board for a woman like her. The waiting was a slow, grinding torment that gnawed at the edges of my discipline. Every rustle of leaves in the forest was a potential footstep. Every passing headlight on the main road was a reconnaissance vehicle. The ghost in my head, the operator, was on high alert, running endless threat simulations, turning our 5 acres of peace into a complex, 3-dimensional battle space of interlocking fields of fire and fatal funnels. I walked the property line each evening at dusk, not as a homeowner enjoying his land, but as a commander inspecting his defenses. I checked the tension on the silent alarms I had woven into the fence line. I cleaned the lenses on the cellular trail cams that watched the neighborhood entrance. I mapped the shadows as they stretched and shifted with the setting sun. I was preparing. Sarah felt the shift in me, in the very air of the house. I had become quiet, distant, my mind clearly elsewhere. The easy warmth that had slowly returned to our lives had receded, replaced by a still, watchful coldness. I was a sentry on a wall she couldn't see, guarding against a threat she could only feel. We moved around each other like ghosts in our own home, the unspoken tension a third presence in every room. "You're expecting them, aren't you?" she asked one evening, her voice small against the loud chorus of crickets outside. We were in the kitchen. I was methodically cleaning my rifle, an old habit that was more about meditation than preparation. The rhythmic, precise motion of cleaning the bolt, of oiling the steel, was a comfort, a familiar ritual from a life I was supposed to have left behind. I didn't look up from my work. "He's lost control of the narrative and the legal high ground," I said, my voice flat and analytical. "His finances are about to be scrutinized by professionals. He's a predator, and predators, when cornered and wounded, revert to their most basic instinct: violence. He needs to reestablish dominance. He needs to make the problem, me, go away. He'll send his dogs. It's the only move he has left." She wrapped her arms around herself. "And what are you going to do?" I finally looked up, my eyes meeting hers across the polished wood of the kitchen table. "I'm going to end it," I said. "Permanently." The coldness in my own voice startled even me. The ghost was no longer just a whisper in my head. He was sitting at the kitchen table with us. The alert came on the third night, just after midnight. It wasn't a high-tech alarm. It was a simple, subtle break in the pattern. My trail cam at the entrance to the neighborhood pinged my phone with a single, grainy, time-stamped image. It was a dark, windowless panel van, the kind used by contractors or kidnappers, its license plates intentionally caked with mud. It didn't belong here. It had turned into the neighborhood, driven half a mile, and then pulled over to the side of the road, its lights off. They weren't coming from the front. They were flanking. They were going to come through the woods. Amateurs. I moved through the house with a silent, fluid grace. I didn't turn on any lights. I went to the main breaker box in the garage and killed the power to the exterior floodlights, plunging the entire property into a deep, natural darkness that I was more comfortable in than they were. I opened the back door just a crack, enough to eliminate the telltale sound of it opening later. I walked to the living room window, a ghost in my own home, and I watched the tree line, my eyes already adjusted to the gloom. 20 minutes later, I saw them. 2 figures, black shapes detaching themselves from the deeper black of the forest. They moved with clumsy, heavy footsteps, their arrogance making them loud. They were carrying tools, crowbars, a heavy bolt cutter. They thought they were on a simple mission of vandalism and intimidation. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they had just walked into a prepared ambush, meticulously designed by a man who had spent his life turning the enemy's aggression into his own greatest weapon. My yard was no longer a lawn. It was a layered defense system designed to do one thing: shatter their OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. A fighter's ability to function depends on that cycle. If you can break it at the orient phase, if you can destroy their ability to understand what is happening to them, they cannot decide, and they cannot act. They become little more than panicked animals. And I was about to introduce them to a world of absolute sensory chaos. As they reached the edge of Sarah's garden, their boots tripped a nearly invisible fishing line I had strung just above the grass. It wasn't a booby trap. It was a trigger. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. A series of high-powered, agricultural-grade sprinklers I had replumbed and aimed earlier erupted from the ground, not with water, but with a pressurized blast of cold, foul-smelling liquid, a mixture of coyote urine, deer repellent, and concentrated fish emulsion I had bought at the local feed store. It was a viscous, clinging fluid that soaked them in an instant, the shocking cold and the nauseating stench an immediate, visceral assault on their senses. Simultaneously, the tripwire activated a series of small, hidden speakers I had placed around the yard. There was no music, no warning, just a cacophony of disorienting sound I had engineered on my laptop. It was a layered audio attack. The high-pitched, nerve-shredding whine of dental drills, the panicked screeching of pigs at a slaughterhouse, and a low-frequency bass tone that vibrated at around 19 hertz. The so-called fear frequency, a sound that is felt more than heard, creating a primal, inexplicable sense of dread and anxiety in the human chest. They were soaked in filth, blinded by the sudden spray, and deafened by a soundscape from hell. Their world, which seconds before had been a quiet, dark yard, had become a nightmare. Their OODA loop was shattered. They couldn't observe. They couldn't orient. They stumbled around, yelling in confusion, their flashlights cutting useless, frantic beams through the misty spray. They were no longer a team of aggressors. They were two isolated, terrified men. That's when I engaged. The first target was the rookie, Kevin. He was the weak link. He had stumbled away from Carl, trying to wipe the stinking liquid from his eyes. I moved through the darkness like a wraith, my footsteps masked by the chaotic noise. I came up behind him, my hand clamping over his mouth, stifling his panicked gasp before it could form. My other arm wrapped around his chest, my bicep constricting against his ribs in a crushing python grip, lifting him off his feet and carrying him backward into the deeper shadows of the large oak tree at the edge of the forest. I didn't hurt him. I controlled him. I deposited him on the ground, my knee pressed firmly into the small of his back, my voice a cold, sibilant whisper directly in his ear. "You made a mistake coming here," I hissed, my breath hot against his skin. "You will be silent. You will stay right here. You will not move until I come back for you. Do you understand me?" He whimpered, a pathetic, terrified sound, and nodded frantically. I released him and melted back into the darkness. Threat neutralized. Time elapsed. 12 seconds. Carl was still in the center of the yard, a raging bull in a china shop. He was spinning in circles, his crowbar held out in front of him, a useless steel wand against an invisible enemy. "Come on out, you coward," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and nascent fear. "Show yourself!" "I'm right here, Carl," I said, my voice calm and conversational, coming from his left, from the direction of the porch. He spun, swinging the heavy crowbar in a wild, horizontal arc that would have decapitated me had I been there. The metal bar whistled through the empty, misty air. "You missed," I said, my voice now coming from his right, from the direction of the garden. "Your form is sloppy." He was panicking now, his breathing coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He lunged towards the house, a desperate, clumsy charge, thinking he could break a window and use the interior light to his advantage. It was the exact move I had anticipated, the move I had wanted him to make. He was channeling his fear into forward aggression, a predictable and fatal mistake. As his boot hit the first step of the porch, I dropped down from the low-hanging roof of the veranda above him. I had been there the entire time, a silent predator perched just above his head. I didn't land with a crash. I landed with the quiet, controlled precision of a cat, my entire body weight of 200 pounds of dense muscle and bone, driving him face first into the wooden planks of the porch. The impact was brutal. The crowbar flew from his grasp and clattered across the deck. He rolled over, his face a mask of contorted rage and utter disbelief. He was big, and he was strong, and he was fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline and terror. He threw a wild, telegraphed right hook. I didn't block it. I redirected it. I met his wrist with my open palm, guiding the force of his blow harmlessly past my head, using his own momentum to pull him off balance. I didn't strike back. I controlled him. I systematically dismantled his ability to fight, not with brute force, but with the cold, brutal geometry of close-quarters combat. I secured his right arm, my hand gripping his wrist, my other hand cupping his elbow. I applied a simple, inescapable rotating joint lock. He roared in pain as the ligaments in his shoulder stretched to their breaking point. He tried to resist, but it was like trying to fight the tide. I was using his own strength against him, the mechanics of his own body as a weapon. He managed to break free, a testament to his raw, animal strength, and scrambled to his feet. He was a former army grunt, I remembered from my research, not a paper pusher, and he had some residual training. He dropped into a recognizable, if clumsy, fighting stance. He was trying to re-engage, to turn this back into a fight he thought he could win. It was the last mistake he would ever make. He lunged. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing charge. I didn't retreat. I moved into him. I sidestepped his charge, my body brushing past his, and as he went by, I applied a textbook brachial stun, a precise, open-handed strike to the side of the neck, targeting the carotid artery and the vagus nerve. It's not a knockout blow, it's a system reboot. It temporarily disrupts blood flow to the brain, causing an instantaneous, non-lethal neurological shutdown. His eyes rolled back in his head, the aggression draining from his face, replaced by a slack, empty confusion. He collapsed onto the lawn in a heap, not unconscious but momentarily paralyzed, his body rebooting like a crashed computer. I walked over to the rookie, who was still huddled in the shadows, paralyzed with a fear far more effective than any physical restraint. I pulled him roughly to his feet. Then I retrieved the crowbar. I pressed its cold, heavy steel into his trembling hands. "Your friend is having a moment," I said, my voice a low, dangerous calm. "He needs to rest. You will put him in your van. You will leave this property. You will then leave this state. You will forget Mr. Thorne's name. You will forget this address. If I ever see either of you again, if I ever hear of you working for Thorne again in any capacity, I will find you." I leaned in close, my voice dropping to a near-silent whisper, a promise of biblical finality. "And the next lesson will be permanent." He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified recognition. He wasn't just looking at a homeowner. He was looking at something else, something he had only seen in training videos or heard about in hushed, fearful stories. He recognized the economy of motion, the clinical efficiency, the absolute absence of rage in the application of overwhelming violence. "What the hell are you?" he gasped, the words tumbling out in a choked whisper. I leaned in even closer, my face inches from his, the ghost finally showing its face. "I'm the guy who spent a decade hunting men 10 times more dangerous than you for a living," I whispered, "and now I'm retired. I came here for peace." I straightened up, the full weight of my presence pressing down on him, "and I will have my peace." I didn't need to say anything else. I stood there, a silent statue in the darkness, and I watched as the terrified rookie managed to half-drag, half-carry Carl's disoriented, stumbling bulk back to the van. He didn't even bother to close the doors properly before peeling out of my driveway, leaving a trail of rubber, shame, and the nauseating stench of fish emulsion behind him. The physical threat was neutralized. The dogs had been put back on their leash, and then the leashes had been cut. But the real enemy, the man who had sent them, was still sitting on his throne, believing himself to be safe. Now it was time to topple the king. The adrenaline of the fight, a white-hot, blinding inferno, evaporated into the cold night air, leaving behind not a victor's satisfaction, but the chilling, metallic taste of purpose. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel relief. I felt the quiet, profound focus of a man who had just completed one violent objective and was already moving on to the next, more critical phase of the operation. The physical threat was neutralized, a messy but necessary prelude to the real war. Now it was time to wage a campaign of annihilation against Thorne's entire organization, A campaign fought not with fists and fury, but with the cold, silent weapons of information, fear, and the unyielding, crushing weight of the law. I moved with the methodical precision of a crime scene investigator in my own violated sanctuary. I retrieved the rookie's dropped crowbar, its steel still cold from the night air. Using a clean rag from my workshop, I carefully wiped it clean of his prints, then my own, and placed it in a labeled evidence bag. I walked the perimeter of the fight, my eyes, trained to see what others miss, scanning the disturbed earth. I collected the small, almost invisible pieces of the encounter. A single, tarnished brass button that had popped off Carl's shirt during the struggle. A few drops of his blood on a jagged edge of a slate garden stone. The distinct, muddy tire tracks left by the fleeing panel van. Each item was photographed with a scale reference, its location logged in my notebook, and then sealed in its own evidence bag. This wasn't for the local police. This was for my own private file, a meticulous, undeniable record of their criminal trespass and armed escalation. This was ammunition for the war to come. When I re-entered the house through the back door, the silence within was a physical weight, heavier and more oppressive than the night outside. Sarah was sitting in the dark living room, a single lamp casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar furniture into monstrous shapes. She wasn't looking at me, but at the window, at the yard where the violence had just unfolded. The gulf between us was no longer just emotional. It felt geographical, an impassable chasm that had opened up in our own home. She had seen what I had done, the terrifying, almost inhuman efficiency with which I had dispatched 2 grown men. She had not seen a protector defending his home. She had seen a predator reclaiming his territory. The ghost was out of his cage, and he terrified her. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper that threatened to break against the heavy silence. "The fighting is over," I said, choosing my words with surgical care as I walked past her towards my office. "The war has just begun." I didn't try to explain further. She wouldn't understand. Not yet. I walked into my office, the command center, and closed the door, the soft click of the latch sounding like the ceiling of a vault. The time for physical action was past. It was now time for a campaign of psychological and legal warfare so total, so devastating, that Thorne would not just be defeated, he would be systematically erased. I sat down at my desk and glanced at the global clock on my screen. It was 2:27 p.m. in Karachi, Sindh, Pakistan. I took a moment, letting that fact settle. In that chaotic, violent corner of the world, men I once knew were likely operating in the shadows, hunting a different kind of tyrant, navigating a world of immense, deadly consequence. Here, in the deceptive tranquility of my American suburb, my own war seemed petty in comparison. But it wasn't. The principle was the same. A cancer, left unchecked, will always metastasize. My little war on Oak Street was just as necessary as the larger wars fought in the shadows across the globe. Phase 1. The Fear Campaign. My first move was to sever the head of the snake from its body. Thorne's power was built on the loyalty, or rather, the terrified obedience, of his underlings. I needed to shatter that foundation. I took out a clean, untraceable burner phone I kept for emergencies, a tool of a former life. I composed a simple 2-sentence text message. It was anonymous, sent from a spoofed number that would appear to originate from a cell tower in a different state. I sent it to the personal cell phone number I had found for Thorne during my initial intelligence gathering. The message read, "Your dogs are off the leash. They talk. You're next." I imagined him waking up to that message, the screen of his $1,000 phone glowing in the dark of his sterile, oversized bedroom. His 2 enforcers, his primary instruments of physical intimidation, were gone. They weren't answering their phones. They had vanished into the night. And now, this, a message from a ghost. It was designed to do one thing: plant a seed of deep, gnawing paranoia in his mind. Were Carl and Kevin talking to the police? Had they flipped, trading their loyalty for a deal? Who sent this message? It offered no answers, only a threat. It would turn his own thoughts against him, making him see shadows in every corner, betrayal in every face. A man consumed by fear cannot think strategically. He can only react. And I wanted him reacting, making mistakes, while I calmly moved on to the next phase. Phase 2, the community schism. Thorne's second pillar of power was his control over the community narrative. He used the HOA's official channels, the newsletter, the Facebook group, as his personal propaganda machine, broadcasting his version of reality and ruthlessly silencing all dissent. It was time to burn that machine to the ground. At precisely 8 a.m. the next morning, as residents were drinking their morning coffee and scrolling through their phones, the anonymous email landed in their inboxes. The audio file of Thorne ordering Carl to make sure the wife gets the message was the primary weapon. But it wasn't just the audio. The email was a masterpiece of strategic information warfare, designed not just to inform, but to incite a rebellion. It included a link to a hastily built, anonymous, and untraceable website. On that website, I posted everything. The full, unedited security footage of the initial assault on Sarah, showing the unprovoked, brutal nature of the attack. High-resolution photographs of her bruised face, clinical and damning. A link to the public records of Carl's prior assault charges and the details of his firing for theft. A scanned copy of the fraudulent lien that had been used to steal the Holloway's home, alongside a tearful written testimony from their daughter. And finally, a detailed, easy-to-understand infographic breaking down the HOA's finances, showing the clear, undeniable money trail that led from their resident dues directly to the shell corporation owned by Thorne's wife. The effect was like dropping a lit match into a munitions factory. The Creekwood Estates Facebook group, once a sleepy forum for posting pictures of lost cats and complaining about garbage collection, erupted into a digital firestorm. Thorne's carefully crafted image as a benevolent protector of property values was incinerated in a matter of minutes. People were posting the audio file, the link to the website, their own long-suppressed stories of Thorne's bullying and financial malfeasance. He tried to fight back, his designated board members frantically deleting posts, banning members. But for every post they deleted, 10 more appeared. He had lost control. The digital mob, armed with the truth, was tearing him apart. He was a king watching his own subjects storm the castle, and his walls were made of paper. Phase 3, the financial attack and federal escalation. While the community was in revolt, the real attack was happening in the silent, invisible world of high finance and federal law enforcement. My old contact at the Department of Justice, a brilliant and relentless prosecutor named Marcus, had received my target package. He called me on an encrypted line that afternoon. "Alex," he said, his voice a low, appreciative hum. "You told me you were retired. This doesn't look like retirement. This looks like a declaration of war." "He put his hands on my wife, Marcus," I said, my voice cold and flat. "He declared it. Not me." There was a long pause. "The file is comprehensive," he said, a significant understatement. "The local stuff, the HOA fraud, the embezzlement, it's a solid state-level case. But the wire fraud charges you've outlined are the key. That gives us federal jurisdiction. Tell me about this Cypress Point development." I walked him through it, through the web of offshore lenders and shell corporations. He needed a way to clean the dirty money from the fraudulent loans, I explained, and he used the HOA and the equity he stole from residents like the Holloways as part of his laundering cycle. It's a classic RICO predicate, Marcus agreed, but these offshore accounts are a labyrinth. It could take us a year to get the warrants and subpoenas to untangle this. There's more, I said. I found something last night. A final piece. It's the linchpin. I directed him to the last file in the package, a file I had only uncovered in the final hours of my deep dive. It was a single, heavily encrypted transaction record I had pulled from a server in Eastern Europe. It had taken all of my old skills, and a piece of software that technically shouldn't exist outside of a 3-letter agency, to find and decrypt it. I heard the sound of him typing, then a sharp intake of breath. Jesus, Alex. Are you seeing this? On his screen, and mine, was a detailed record of a SWIFT transfer. It was a wire of $250,000 sent from Creekwood Equity Partners, Thorne's primary money laundering vehicle, to a numbered account at a private, unregulated bank. But it was the location of the bank that made it a federal crime of the highest order. The bank wasn't in the Cayman Islands or Switzerland. The transaction, dated March 12, 2025, had been routed through a holding company based in Karachi, Pakistan, the same city that was the subject of this morning's intelligence brief. That's not just a money laundering haven, Alex, Marcus said, his voice now devoid of its earlier warmth, replaced by the cold, hard edge of a federal prosecutor who had just found a smoking gun. That holding company, according to the intel we're tracking right now, has known ties to designated terrorist financing networks. Your HOA tyrant isn't just a local crook, he just crossed the line into a national security threat. By sending that money, likely as a fee for the laundering service, Thorne had not just committed wire fraud, he had potentially, and unknowingly, violated the Patriot Act. He had turned his petty suburban criminal enterprise into a matter of international importance. He thought he was a king. In reality, he was a minnow who had just swum into a shark tank. This changes everything, Marcus said, his voice now clipped and urgent. I'm no longer just interested. I'm taking this to the top. I can get a FISA warrant on this. We can move fast. Very fast. Stay put. And Alex, stay retired. Let us handle it from here. I hung up. Thorne's fate was now sealed. He thought he was fighting a disgruntled homeowner. He had no idea he was now the target of a full-spectrum federal investigation that had started with a punch in a quiet suburb and now stretched all the way to the shadowy world of terror finance in Karachi. Phase 4. Total isolation and collapse. The federal hammer fell with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking to behold. On Monday morning, simultaneous raids were executed. It wasn't local cops. It was teams of FBI agents in tactical gear, supported by forensic accountants from the IRS. They didn't just raid Thorne's office. They hit his home, his lawyer's office, and the home of his son-in-law, Philip, all at the same time. It was a coordinated, multi-location takedown, executed with the kind of precision that only comes when you have a perfect blueprint of the enemy's network. My target package had been that blueprint. Thorne was rendered powerless. His assets were frozen. His computers were seized. His records were confiscated. He was a king trapped in a crumbling castle, with no army and no treasury. His last line of defense, his political cover, Councilman Bob Laren, saw the federal writing on the wall. That same afternoon, Lauren held a press conference, his face a mask of feigned shock and outrage, in which he called Thorne a cancer on our community and pledged his full cooperation with the federal investigation. He had cut Thorne loose, saving his own skin. Thorne was now completely and utterly alone. He was a pariah in his own neighborhood, his name a curse on the lips of the residents he had once terrorized. His enforcers had abandoned him. His political allies had betrayed him. and the full, terrifying weight of the United States federal government was now pressing down on him. I watched it all from the quiet sanctuary of my home. I watched the news reports. I read the breathless articles. Sarah sat with me, her hand resting quietly on mine. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a slow, dawning understanding. She was finally seeing the ghost, not as a monster, but as a protector, a dark, necessary force that I had kept chained in the basement of my soul for her, for us. Thorn was broken, his power was gone. His world had been dismantled piece by piece, exactly as I had planned. The final act was not about punishment, it was about erasure. It was about ensuring that he could never again use his wealth and his influence to harm another innocent family. The war was over. All that was left was the sentencing. The end, when it came, was not a thunderous explosion, but the quiet, inexorable closing of a steel trap. For a week after the federal raids, Thorn was a ghost in his own life, a man besieged from all sides, trapped in a soundproof prison of his own making. The clock on my monitor read 2:30 p.m. in Karachi, Sindh, Pakistan. I let that sink in. Sunday, September 7th, 2025. In that hot, dusty, and volatile corner of the world, federal agents and intelligence, officers were hunting men who moved in the shadows, men who dealt in violence and chaos on a global scale. Here, on my quiet, sun-drenched street, I was watching a different kind of monster in its death throes. My little war, I realized, had ended a local tyranny, but had also, in some small, indirect way, touched that larger, global struggle. The money Thorn had laundered, the dirty profits from the pain he had inflicted on my neighbors, had passed through the same dark financial arteries that funded the men I used to hunt. He was a cancer, and the surgery had been a success. Thorn's name was a stain in the local press. His friends in the community, the ones who had once basked in the reflected glow of his power, now crossed the street to avoid his house. His bank accounts were frozen, his power stripped away, his world shrinking with each passing hour. I watched him from a distance, a digital phantom tracking his every move. I had reactivated my surveillance network, not for a threat, but for an endgame. I saw the late-night visits from his lawyers, their expensive cars arriving and leaving in the dark. I saw the frantic, panicked energy that radiated even through the grainy thermal feed of my trail cam as he paced behind his large, plate-glass windows like a caged animal. He was trapped, and he knew it. A man like Thorn, a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of dominance and control, does not surrender. He flees. The final move of the game came on a Thursday night, just before midnight. My trail cam at the neighborhood entrance, the silent sentinel, pinged my phone with a single time-stamped image. It wasn't Thorn's black Navigator. It was his wife's silver Mercedes, a vehicle he never drove, slipping out of the subdivision like a thief in the night. It was an amateur's attempt at misdirection, a pathetic ploy from a man who thought he was a master strategist, but was, in the end, just a common crook. He was running. I zoomed in on the image, a single figure in the driver's seat, a man's silhouette. I ran the license plate through a public database. It confirmed the vehicle belonged to Eleanor Thorn. He thought he was being clever. He was being predictable. I didn't call the local police. Their part in this was over. I made one last encrypted call to Marcus at the DOJ. "He's on the move," I said, my voice calm, the report of a field operative to his handler. "Silver Mercedes, wife's registration." "He's not heading for the main international airport. That's too obvious. He's smarter than that, but not by much. There's a smaller executive airfield an hour north. Private charters, lack security. He'll have a plane waiting. He thinks he can disappear." "He's not wrong to think it," Marcus replied, his voice a low hum of controlled energy. A man with his resources can buy a new identity in a dozen different countries. But he made one fatal mistake. He got your attention. There was a pause on the line, the sound of keyboard clicks in the background. We've had a federal air marshal team on standby at that airfield for the last 48 hours, just on a hunch. Your hunch. I'll make the call now. Nice work, Alex. We'll take it from here. Thorne's final act was not one of defiance, but of pathetic, desperate escape. His public humiliation, however, was still to come. The federal agents didn't arrest him at the dark, lonely airfield. That would have been too merciful, too private. They tracked him. They let him believe he was getting away. The next morning, armed with the information from Thorne's seized calendars and the full, terrified cooperation of his son-in-law, they found him where he felt most powerful, most untouchable, the grand, sun-drenched dining room of the Oakmont Country Club. It was his inner sanctum, a place of hushed tones, of clinking silverware against fine china, of the quiet, confident murmur of old money and corrupt power. He was seated at his usual table by the large bay windows overlooking the 18th green. He was surrounded by his wealthy associates, the bankers, the developers, the politicians who had been the pillars of his corrupt world. He was trying to project an aura of calm, of a man weathering a temporary storm, a minor inconvenience that would soon be handled by his expensive lawyers. He was laughing, a brittle, forced sound that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes as he lifted a glass of expensive champagne to his lips. That's when they entered. Not local cops, 4 men in dark, impeccably tailored suits. They moved through the room with a silent, coordinated purpose that immediately silenced the idle chatter. They were FBI. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They simply walked to his table and stood there, 4 silent angels of legal retribution, their presence a stark, brutal intrusion into this world of pampered privilege. Mr. Thorne, the lead agent said, his voice quiet but carrying the full, unyielding weight of the United States federal government. You're under arrest. Thorne's face, so carefully composed, so expertly Botoxed into a mask of serene superiority, shattered. The color drained from his skin, leaving a pasty, gray pallor of pure, unadulterated shock. The champagne glass, the symbol of his victory lap, slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the pristine white tablecloth, the sound like a gunshot in the suddenly completely silent room. His friends, the men who had profited from his corruption, the men who had laughed at his jokes just seconds before, didn't move to help him. They looked away. They studied their napkins with intense interest. They suddenly became fascinated by the intricate pattern on the wallpaper. In that moment, Thorne was utterly, completely alone. He had been socially executed. They let him out in handcuffs, his head bowed, the king of Creekwood Estates now a common criminal, paraded through the very hall that had once been the symbol of his power and influence. The image of his perp walk, captured by a news helicopter hovering outside, became the defining photograph of the scandal. It was a picture of a tyrant who had been dethroned, a bully who had finally met a force he couldn't intimidate. It was a picture of a man who had built an empire of fear, now looking small and weak and utterly terrified. The legal annihilation that followed was a formality, a slow, grinding process of total erasure. The federal indictment was a work of art, a 50-page document detailing his entire criminal enterprise, from the petty extortion of the Holloways to the complex web of international money laundering. The charges were overwhelming: multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and the charge that sealed his fate, violating the Patriot Act by routing funds through the terror financing network based in Karachi. That last detail, when it was unsealed, sent a shockwave through the national news. Thorn wasn't just a local crook who bullied old people. He was a disgrace who had, in his bottomless greed, inadvertently brushed up against the enemies of the state. Facing a lifetime in a maximum security prison, and with every one of his former associates, from his lawyer to Councilman Laren to his own son-in-law, lining up to testify against him in exchange for a deal, he took a plea. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had clearly seen enough of men like Thorn, who believed their wealth put them above the law, made an example of him. She sentenced him to 10 years in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of parole. But his punishment wasn't just about time, it was about erasure. As part of the deal, he agreed to a complete asset forfeiture. Everything, his houses, his cars, his art collection, his offshore accounts, was seized by the federal government. His wealth, the source of his power and his identity, was wiped from the face of the earth. He would leave prison a broken old man, a ghost in a world that had moved on without him. His kingdom was dismantled with the same clinical precision. A federal judge signed a court order officially and permanently dissolving the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association, declaring it a predatory criminal enterprise from its inception. A court-appointed receiver was tasked with liquidating all of its assets and establishing a restitution fund. The primary beneficiaries of that liquidation were Thorn's victims. The Holloways, their faces a mixture of disbelief and tearful joy when I called them personally to deliver the news, were the first to receive a check. It was more than enough to buy back their old home, which the government had seized from Thorn's son-in-law. 2 months later, I stood on my porch and watched as a moving truck pulled up to their house on Willow Lane. I saw Maria Holloway, her hands trembling, walk into her old garden and gently touch the petals of a single resilient rose that had survived the neglect. It was a small, quiet moment of profound justice. Dozens of other families received full restitution for every fraudulent fine, every illegal fee they had been forced to pay. The community, purged of the cancer that had been killing it from within, began to heal. The oppressive weight of Thorn's rule was gone. People started talking to each other again, not as suspicious adversaries, but as neighbors. They planted gardens filled with unfeminine wildflowers. They painted their front doors whatever color they damn well pleased. They tore up Thorn's Book of Covenants, and with the help of Sarah's cousin Mia, formed a new, voluntary neighborhood watch, a true community built on mutual respect, not fear. My war was over. The ghost in my head, the operator I had been forced to resurrect, had completed his mission. He had identified the threat, dismantled the network, and neutralized the target. Now he could finally, truly, stand down. The silence he left behind was not an absence of noise. It was the presence of peace. The final scene of the entire ordeal was not one of victory or vengeance, but one of simple, profound restoration. It was a warm Saturday afternoon a few months later. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming jasmine. Sarah and I were in her garden, on our knees in the rich, dark soil, planting a new bed of sunflowers where the thugs had tried to leave a scar. The physical and emotional chasm that had opened between us in the heat of the battle was gone, filled in by a quiet, resilient understanding. She looked at me, her hands covered in dirt, a smudge of soil on her cheek. The memory of the assault was still there, a faint shadow behind her eyes, but it no longer held any power over her. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. She was a gardener, tending to her sacred ground. She smiled, a real, genuine smile, the first one I had seen that seemed to reach all the way to her soul. I handed her a small trowel, its wooden handle worn smooth from use. "I think," I said, my voice soft, the words carrying the weight of our entire journey, "we finally have the peace we were looking for." She took my hand, her grip firm and steady, her fingers interlaced with mine. She looked from my face to the vibrant, thriving garden around us, a testament to her unbreakable spirit. "No," she said, her eyes shining with a strength that humbled me. "We didn't find it, Alex. We fought for it. We built it." And in that moment, I knew she was right. Peace wasn't a place you could retreat to. It was a structure you had to build, a garden you had to tend, a line you had to defend. I was no longer the man who froze, nor the man who fought. I was simply her husband again, a gardener in his own sanctuary, a man finally at peace in his own skin. The ghost wasn't gone. He never would be. But he was no longer haunting. He was a guardian, a silent sentry on the wall of the life we had built together, ensuring that no one would ever breach it again. The mission was finally, truly complete.